Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 7th session of China 101, hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute. Thank you for joining us, especially for this time change to 11 a.m. We appreciate you all making yourselves available this morning. I'd like to get the briefing started with just a few housekeeping notes. For congressional staffers who are in attendance, please note that China 101 is a professional development program. Those of you who attend 4 or more 8 sessions will receive a professional development certificate from USAI. We want to make sure that we record everyone's attendance today. So if you could either email china101@usasiainstitute.org that you logged in, or you can send me, Zev Moses, a chat directly with your name and email. We'll mark down your attendance. There will also be time for questions from the audience after remarks today. If you have a question you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the chat function at any time, directly message me, or email china101@usasiainstitute.org. And I will forward your question to our moderator today. With so many people on the call, it can be difficult to call on people. The China 101 program would not have been possible without the steadfast support of the U.S. House and Senate U.S.-China working groups. Our thanks to them, especially the staff contacts, J.Z. Golden, Dan Gehrig, Liz Benicki, Jed Derkol, and Ashley Antoskiewicz. A special thanks too for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders, Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, and ConocoPhillips. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Kent Lucan. Kent is a managing director at Citigroup in Boston, where he leads Citi's engagement with private equity and infrastructure funds. He's a 14-year veteran of the Foreign Service, where he completed assignments in Italy, the Soviet Union and Russia, Georgia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia. Kent also served as a foreign policy and national security advisor to Senator Romney's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. And he's a featured commentator on foreign affairs for the New York Times, NPR, and the Boston Globe. Kent is also the former chairman and president of the U.S. Asia Institute. We are very fortunate to have his experience and expertise today. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Kent.
Yeah, thank you, Zev. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have an international set of participants, and it's very exciting to see such a large turnout today for what I am confident will be a very interesting discussion. As I think you know, the U.S. Asia Institute is a leading nonpartisan United Nations affiliated nonprofit with a 41-year track record of promoting a better understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. And today we're hosting a special briefing that will, I think, really get at the essence of what our Institute is about as we explore U.S.-China relations and examine what each country can do to rebuild trust in what I would describe as this COVID world and hopefully soon a post-COVID world. We're fortunate to have with us today 2 top experts to lead this briefing, both friends of mine and friends of our Institute. First, I'd like to welcome Susan Thornton. Susan is currently a visiting lecturer at Yale University Law School and senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center. She's also the director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She has nearly 30 years of experience working at the State Department on East Asian and Eurasia affairs. She served as acting Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs until 2018, where she led policymaking on China and Korea, including the U.S.-China Cyber Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, and a framework for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. She also served in leadership positions at her embassies overseas for 18 years in Central Asia, Russia, and China. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Xiao Yujin. Dr. Xiao is the director of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies and is a senior member at the Center for American Studies. She previously served as the deputy director of the Department of American Studies and the director at the Department of Research and Management and International Exchange at SIIS. She's worked very closely with the Institute over the years, and we're appreciative for all she's done in that regard on those exchanges. She received her doctorate in international relations at Fudan University. So we have two great speakers, and I look forward to hearing their perspectives. You can read more about Susan and Dr. Shao in the attached program, but Susan, why don't you get us started?
Great. Thanks so much, Ken, and great to have everyone with us. It is indeed inspiring to see so many people signed up for this program today. And Dr. Shao, again, please, I want to thank you for staying up so late in Shanghai to be with us today, and it's great to see you. I think I'm not going to talk for very long because I really want the participants and the audience to ask us questions about what they're interested in, but my remarks will focus sort of in general on US-China relations, where we are and where we probably should be thinking about heading in the future if we want to have a constructive and productive for the United States relationship with China, which I hope and think we all should want. I think it's important to understand right now that we're in a classic security dilemma. That is, in the case of two generally less than confident and secure powers, each sees the other as trying to gain advantage in every move. And one side undertakes escalatory deterrent measures to try to show resolve in responding to moves by the other side. But the other side views such reactions as new offensive moves and responds to beef up the deterrent and so on and so forth. And that is the cycle that we are in now, this kind of tit for tat retaliation, but it's also based on real security perspectives and fears. I think this is happening now because the US has become worried about China's growing power in the international system and its designs for that increasing clout in the system. And I think there are very legitimate reasons for this worry. China is doing many things that the US does not like. I think probably many of you on the call have in mind some specific issues you may want to talk about. I don't want to dwell on all of these things now because I don't want to talk for a long time, and we do have time constraints on the call. But the bottom line is that the US is, I think, justified in worrying about how China will use its growing power. The current US idea on how to deal with this, at least in some quarters, seems to be to try to reverse China's accrual of power in the international system by inhibiting its economic progress. And you hear people in the current US administration say things like this, although it's not completely clear if that's the strategy and the approach or not. I think this is a flawed approach. China's economy has to be part of the global economic system. And it has to be part of that system, though, in a way that, although it will have a very heavy weight in the system, that it will not be disruptive to the principles of global trade and investment and economic activity that can work fairly for all countries. So at the same time, of course, China has to persuade others of its intentions in wielding clout in the international system. And I think its recent aggressive military moves, other punitive economic measures toward entire countries, if there's one person in that country that says something China doesn't like, obviously is pushing against the imperative of China's sort of acting within the system in a way that other people can see as fair. So the Chinese ambassador, Cui Tiankai, who is a very good diplomat and also someone that I have a great amount of respect for, said in a speech, I believe it was yesterday, that the fundamental choice that the US has to make is about whether or not it can live with a modern and powerful China. And I personally think this is not the choice, although I have a great deal of respect for Ambassador Cui. Of course, the US will live with China. China is not going anywhere. It's a reality. It's 1/5 of humanity. China had 40%, contributed 40% of global economic growth last year. But China is not an existential threat to the United States, and the United States does not pose an existential threat to China. The choice is over how we will live together. And will we live in prosperity or privation? Will we live in cooperation or conflict? China has as much to do with this choice, I think, as America does. And Americans are, frankly, I have to say it, Dr. Shao, fed up with China putting the onus on the US to make all the adjustments. So becoming a major power does not simply mean that you now get to, run roughshod over other countries' interests. I think in this respect, actually, to be fair, the US may not always provide an ideal example, but the current international system, which the US had a hand in establishing, does reflect efforts to create balance and rules for everyone that everyone has to follow. So I think, this is an indicator, at least of intentions that are meant to try to balance the international system away from this power politics that we've seen so often lead to wars and conflicts in the past. What should we do to make things better? First, we need, of course, to begin talking to each other again and try to interrupt this security dilemma, this escalation ladder that we're on. Diplomacy has really fallen far off the radar in this administration. In my view, FONOPs and sanctions are, of course, tools in the diplomatic toolkit, but they are far up the escalation ladder, especially when they're done to provoke, which in my view, too often recently has been the case. I have to say, I was just reading over the weekend John Bolton's book, and was struck again by I was struck by a lot of things in John Bolton's book, but one of the things that I was struck by was the complete absence of conversations that he had with Chinese interlocutors. As the National Security Advisor, he met once with a Chinese counterpart in his own meeting. I mean, that is unprecedented. So the United States cannot have strong diplomacy without talking to other countries. It's impossible to gauge other countries' interests without hearing from them directly. And this administration, I think, has been ignoring other countries' interests, which is why the diplomacy has produced so little in the way of progress and outcomes. I think, no deal can really be done with foreign countries without knowing what it is the other guy wants and what the other guy needs. And the only way to find that out is by talking. The US have conflicts, obviously, over what we want for ourselves in the world, and we need to discuss those and see if there is an acceptable way forward. And this will require very substantive and frank discussions like those that were had between Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger way back at the beginning of this relationship. And I think too frequently, the Chinese side, especially in recent years, has seemed very limited in its ability to discuss frankly what it is seeking, what it wants. And I think if we can not have serious conversations about our future visions for ourselves in the world, we will not be able to get them to acceptably materialize, and we will be headed for a confrontation. So I think at least I hope, we're both, too wise, our two governments are too wise to allow this to happen. But we do need to start having a very serious discussion about how these competing interests that we have about our futures in the world are going to be resolved adequately to allow us to coexist in a way that I think we all want to see the relationship evolve. So I'll just stop there. Thanks, Kent.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Sorry.
Great opening, really appreciate it. Dr. Shao, welcome your
Yes.
opening remarks, and please.
Yeah. First of all, please allow me to thank the US Asia Institute, Kent, Mary Sue and the others inviting me to join today's discussion. And the topic, rebuild trust between China and the United States, is a very timely one. And since a stable and healthy bilateral relationship is in the interest of both China and the United States. I think Susan has made her points very clearly, and I appreciate her remarks. I agree some of her views, and of course I a little bit disagree with some other parts. Due to the time limits, I will talk a little bit about the steps that we need to take in order to rebuild the trust. And so these views are my own, and I hope that I can make myself understood clearly. First of all, I think if we want to rebuild the trust between the two major countries, then certainly for the United States, for this government, I think it should stop using, I called it the regime change strategy towards China. Because what I have been watching is that the US administration is trying to separate the Chinese Communist Party with the Chinese people. And recently, just a few days ago, that we read the news, the media reports, that the White House is considering kind of visa bans on all the CCP members and their family members. So it's the kind of a regime change, from my view, towards China. And Susan just said that the choice is how we will live together. So if the two major countries want to live together peacefully, I don't think this kind of a regime change strategy is okay. And so, so if we want to rebuild the trust, I think the first thing is please stop using this kind of strategy towards China. Secondly, I agree with Susan that we should bring back diplomacy. We need dialogues, and we need working mechanisms for two sides to talk to each other. I understand that for several years, our American colleagues fatigue for dialogues. For example, they mentioned that the SNED, the dialogue, people spend a lot of time on preparing for dialogue, but they haven't seen any results, tangible results coming out of the dialogue. I understand that. But the current situation is that all of the four major dialogues mechanisms are just stopped. And so which made this bilateral relations into a very difficult situation, because the counterparts, they just don't talk to each other. And certainly, I think we should identify our common interests and also try to define the concept of competition. We need to identify our common interests in order to let us understand that a win-win cooperation is not just a slogan that adopted by Chinese side, and it doesn't mean that China wins once and China wins twice. I think it's a joke, but when some senior officials from the United States government said this kind of things to the audience domestically and internationally, I think we are lack of understanding of so many common interests between our two countries. So if we can identify those common interests clearly, then we will see the kind of cooperation between our two countries is not an empty slogan. We really need cooperation on climate change, on energy, on how to deal with this pandemic, right? On North Korean nuclear issue, the economic recovery, all those things. And then we have to define the concept of competition in order not to let this competition become the current confrontation. I think when we talk about competition, what kind of sectors are we talking about? And then what are the rules? And then what are the implications for the third parties? Whether we can have a clear understanding of that. So this is the third step. And the fourth one is we should rethink about all those phrases that we are talking about. For example, decoupling. And also engagement policy is kind of failure. What do these things really mean? Do we really think that the engagement policy is a kind of a failure? I don't think so. And I think both our two countries have benefited from the engagement policy adopted by the United States. And also, for example, China is a revisionist country. What does it mean? In China, we have very different views. When you talk about China trying to challenge the liberal international order. And then the fifth one is we should continue to promote people-to-people exchanges. Right now, it's really a kind of pity for me to hear the news that the Fulbright programs have been stopped. And then students, the Chinese students, they just cannot go to the United States to study. Some because of the pandemic, and some because of the US government's policy on those students who study STEM majors in the United States. And so I think the people-to-people exchange is really important, especially at the current time when we just cannot meet face-to-face. On Zoom, on Tengxun, all those things are okay. But we should continue to do this kind of things and stop blaming and shaming. I don't think that kind of things are helpful for us to rebuild the trust between our two countries. I would just stop here. Thank you.
Dr. Shao, thank you very much. That was excellent and much appreciated. The first question that I'd like to explore touched on something Dr. Shao raised, and this is this idea of common interests. And Susan, the American election is 100 days away. I think historically when we are in a presidential season, new foreign policy isn't generated in those kind of 100 days leading up to the election. It's that which comes after. So if you were thinking, you were given the assignment to kind of frame common interests for either the second Trump administration or a new Biden administration, what issues show up on your list where we can find most significant, meaningful cooperation? Dr. Shao raised energy and climate change. I'm sure there are others, financial markets and more, but would love to hear your perspective on that.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, I mean, I've thought a lot about this issue of common interests and cooperation. And just to preface my response, I like to say that there are, and actually Foreign Minister Wang Yi made this point in a speech he gave recently. He said, we have areas of cooperation, we have areas of competition or conflicting interests where we want to have negotiations and discussions and where we can make progress. And then we have areas where we need, where our interests are probably never going to be reconciled. They're in opposition, but we need to handle those issues very carefully and we can manage those issues. So, one thing I noticed in conversations and in our relationship with China over the years is that the areas of cooperation, we agree on those, and many of them are these transnational issues. Non-proliferation, we've cooperated well with China on things like addressing the illegal nuclear programs of other countries such as North Korea and Iran. We have a convergence of interest there. Things like climate change. At first, we didn't really see eye to eye on that one, but we brought China around eventually, and we should be cooperating. Obviously, the pandemic and public health is top of the list, I would say, for pretty much any person observing the global trends and the warnings of scientists in this area. We need to cooperate on this issue. But the problem has been that even to elicit cooperation from China on the areas that are obviously in China's interest to cooperate on has felt like, to many American colleagues, sort of pulling teeth. And it feels like we're working so hard on the areas of cooperation that we never get to those areas where our interests are competing or in conflict, and we never get progress on those issues because we're working so hard just to elicit smooth cooperation on the areas where we have mutual interests. So I think Wang Yi's speech, I take it very much as a challenge to us to come up with a new architecture for effective diplomacy. I think it's clear to the Chinese side that the US, at the very least, I think we all agree in the US that the diplomacy of the last several years has not been that effective in bringing more commonality to our views of how we're going to get along together in the future on some of the tougher issues. And so, you know, I would say that we can put a lot of things in the basket on cooperation. You know, at the top of my list would be public health, climate change, and environment, but also global macro and financial coordination, all the things we've worked, you know, reforming the international system. China is a permanent member of the Security Council and a member of the Permanent Five. So we work with them on all kinds of adjustments in the international system. We've got to do that. Nuclear non-proliferation, et cetera. These are all clear common interests. And I would put a lot more in that basket. But we can't only focus on those in the relationship with China. We can't only get progress on that. We've got to make progress on the issues where our interests are competing. And top of the list for me there is all of these, you know, issues about China's behavior in the international economic system. And if we've really got to get, I mean, we have common interests there, but we also obviously have competing interests, and we've really got to get progress on that. I think there are a number of other issues in this space that have to do with, you know, regulating our security competition. Obviously, we're going to have a security competition, but there are a lot of things we could do to negotiate a safer way of behaving within that competition. We've got to make progress on those issues. And we've been talking about these issues with China. I mean, I was part of a lot of trade negotiations with China in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration. And, you know, people were very frustrated. And I mean, they had good intentions and wanted to make progress. So top of my list for things China should do if it wants to really straighten things out would be focus on the economic reform agenda, market access, intellectual property protection, and subsidies to the state-owned enterprises. Those are the things that, you know, have been really intractable and caused a lot of problems, not just with the US, by the way, with all of China's trading partners. Everyone's getting fed up. So that would be my response. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Dr. Shao, I'd like you to build on Susan's comments, but help us understand something first, and then we can talk about this point. China's government will be the same before and after the American election. Will it undergo a new review of policy or kind of develop response to the American election, or should we expect continuity? In large part, one. And then two, to the question that you raised about common interests, to Susan's point about competing interests, what does your memo to your leadership look like around how China should approach the US-China relationship after the election?
Thank you, Kent, for your questions. First of all, you mentioned the US election, and then whether Chinese policy would continue or have any changes. I think there are two levels. The first level is that our policy towards the United States will continue, because the big trend is doesn't change, because we want to have cooperation with the United States. We still want to be part of the international system. We don't want to challenge this. We don't want to destroy or have a parallel system. So these kind of policies won't change. But on the other level, certainly if Trump President Trump has his second term, we will see whether he would change his policy towards China or it's a kind of a continuation. And then if Joe Biden wins the election, then certainly I think his approach and his policy towards China will be a little bit different comparing with Trump's policy. Then China will have to make its response to Biden's policy. So at that level, we will see certain changes there. And the second question is about Susan talking about those conflicts of interests, yeah, and how China should deal with that. I can understand as I mentioned, the frustration on the American side. On Chinese side, I would say quite many colleagues have this kind of frustration. So I think for China, we should listen more to the international community, not only to the United States, but also to the European countries, the Japanese, other foreign investors. Listen to their concerns, their considerations, their complaints about China's domestic market, the rules that China have adopted, all those things. I agree, China should listen more. And then I think China understands, for example, we take the IPR issue. The IPR is in the interest of China because we want to develop the so-called innovative economy. Then we should certainly to improve the IPR. So it's in our own interest. So to some extent, I agree with Susan. But on the other side, I think the foreign investors should also think why on the Chinese side, the same kind of frustration is there. So I think the two sides should listen more to the other side. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Many of our guests today, many of those listening in, work on Capitol Hill. They work in our legislative branch. And in the last year, there have been a large number of bills introduced that impact the China relationship. Many of them, we could say, kind of tough legislation. So I have a question for both of you. One, Susan, you've worked at the highest levels of the US-China relationship. How, in recognizing that the legislative branch is a complete, separate, and equal branch of government, how do you interface with your Chinese colleagues when legislation is offered? Explain to people how a diplomat manages that, because it's something people don't see. And then for Dr. Shao, I would like to hear how you communicate to your leaders, policymakers about what to actually, kind of, some of this isn't going to actually happen. Some of it's political rhetoric. How do you, you're an experienced observer of American politics. You understand elections and how rhetoric is used to advance a cause, but isn't a real risk. I want to hear your perspective on how China sifts through all these things that are said about the relationship and what you recognize as kind of real and meaningful. So please.
Okay, I guess I get to go first.
Yes.
I think there is a lot of misunderstanding and misperception between the US and China about how each other's systems work. Yeah. The Chinese always say that, they understand the US much better than US people understand China. And, in a way, maybe, but not, I don't think that really China really understands the way our system works maybe as well as they think they do. And I think this is one of the areas that is poorly understood on the part of Chinese counterparts. When legislation is being, right now, I think I've lost track, but somebody told me recently that there are 350 bills in Congress pending or have been proposed or have been drafted at some stage of the process that so-called target China. And this is pretty unprecedented, I would say. And so I think that, one thing that we need to try to understand better, and probably on the US side as well, and maybe the colleagues on the call today can help us with this, is is how is Congress changing on these issues, and how should China be thinking about this? I know that the embassies and consulates that China has in the US they do a lot of work, a lot of outreach to congressional offices, trying to understand, trying to advocate, or at least explain China's positions. This usually doesn't go very well, to be honest. This is not a very good, fruitful conversation and mutual understanding. I think, China is a very unitary system. We're a very sort of fractured system. There's a lot of back and forth and competition and debate over policy in the US. China doesn't have that as much, or at least it's not visible to all of us, where in the US it's very public. China is confused probably by the sort of seeming short-term lens through which a lot of legislation and maybe even congressional members are looking at issues in the US-China relationship. I think they're frustrated because they think they don't have counterparts in the US Congress with which they can converse about long-term US-China relations. I was involved very much in US-China parliamentary exchange mechanisms when I worked in the embassy in Beijing, when I worked in other consulates in China, and we had big delegations of people that I took one big delegation from the House to Tibet. I took a big delegation from the Senate to Xinjiang. And we have not done anything like that really since, in my understanding. So there's not been much of a commitment, I don't think, on the part of, US legislators to really put in the time to build up these relationships. And there's been a lot of, personnel turnover in our Congress that, contributes to that probably. But, clearly there's a lot of misunderstanding here, and it's very hard for diplomats to explain to China, what's going on in Congress and what it's all about. We try to do that and interpret and translate, but it's not always that easy. And building up those relationships themselves is, I think, really important.
That's helpful. Thank you. Dr. Shao?
Yes, I always tell my the government officials or my friends, actually, the ordinary people, that they ask, what is the United States going to do? So my answer is there's no the so-called United States. You should talk about different players in the United States, like U.S. Congress, the White House, the local government or the state government, So we have very different players in the United States. And Susan said that your system is very different comparing with the Chinese. So frequently, the Chinese people, they just don't understand the role of the US Congress. So we try our best to help them understand. But sometimes, even for me, I think it's also difficult for me to understand the things going on the Capitol Hill. But this is one part. And the second part is I try to grasp every opportunity that US Asia Institute, where you send the congressional staff delegation to SIS, I try to exchange views with them. I think it's very helpful for me to understand the views on the Capitol Hill. And my understanding is that the relationship between the government and the civil society in China and in the United States are very different, very different. So when the American business community, for example, if they have concerns and complaints about China, they will go back to the Capitol Hill to make their concerns to those Congress people, to those senators. And then all these things become the bills. But in China, we have very different system, So it's very difficult for the Chinese to understand the role of Congress. But I want to mention one thing is that sometimes the people on the Capitol Hill, they are a little bit ill-informed. For example, today's news is that somebody is trying to adopt the bill, the so-called Taiwan Violation Bill Act. this kind of thing. They try to help Taiwan to show the stronger relationship between United States and Taiwan. But from the mainland's perspective, actually, it's really not helpful. It's made China-U.S. relations move into a very dangerous part. So that's my understanding. I don't know. Sometimes that I myself feel very difficult to understand the role of Congress and how to explain it to the Chinese people.
Excellent, thank you. We're receiving a number of excellent questions from our guests online, and I'm going to turn to a couple of those here. And if we can keep our responses shorter so we can get through as many as we can in the remaining 15, 20 minutes. We'll start with Susan on a question about Hong Kong and then turn to Dr. Xiao. Susan, how do you how does U.S. view the situation in Hong Kong from your perspective, helping lead that relationship? Can you summarize it for us, and what is your perspective about the future vis-a-vis the U.S. and Hong Kong?
This is a really topical and tough question. I've been extremely saddened to see what's happened with Hong Kong in the recent, several years, really starting from, I think, 2014, and then up till now. So 6 years really of huge developments in Hong Kong that, sort of trended in one direction, which could have been prevented with some, not too much even, foresight and more deft handling by a bunch of different parties. Now with the development of the national security legislation from China, I think I'm pretty pessimistic about Hong Kong's future. And I'm really a bit regretful about the role that the US government has played in all of this, although I don't think it's played a major part. But certainly its reaction to the events of the last year, I don't think have been that on point. And I've written about this. I don't think that the legislation passed in Congress has been helpful to Hong Kong. And I don't think that the measures imposed by the administration have been on point either, because most of the responses that we make to things that we don't like China doing in Hong Kong end up hurting people in Hong Kong. And I don't think that it's much of a deterrent or much of a response to authorities in Beijing. But I do see a fairly dark picture now for Hong Kong going forward. I think these September LegCo elections are going to be very important. I'd like to say that I wish and hope that the government in Beijing is not going to use this new national security legislation in a way that's very intrusive or maybe at all. In Macau, there's a similar piece of legislation. There's not been one case brought. So that would be ideal. But I think the government in Beijing is very worried about these LegCo elections coming up in September, and that the responses in Hong Kong are probably, going to cause us to see some more activity, and the law will be used intrusively, and Hong Kong's high level of autonomy, which in my view, everybody should have been working to prolong for as long as possible, will be cut short, unfortunately. And I'm sorry to say that.
Thank you, Susan. Dr. Xiao?
Yes. First of all, I'm not pessimistic about Hong Kong's future.
Good.
I think one country, two systems, the framework. These days, the foreign governments, they focus on the two systems. When they say one country, two systems is dead, they are thinking about the two systems. But in China, people are focusing on one country. So our view is, if there's no one country, then certainly there are no two systems. So one country is the most important thing. And the situation in Hong Kong last year has made the Chinese central government very nervous about whether this kind of one country will be challenged. So right now, the law has passed, and then I think we should move to the next phase, which is the implementation of the law, how to implement the law. This is the challenging part. And I think the Chinese, we can have some dialogues with the foreigners, especially with those legal experts. We should change views on implementation of the law. I think this is very important. And thirdly, I would say the challenges for Hong Kong and for Beijing are there. They won't disappear, even the law has passed. So the governance issue is there. And also the autonomy of Hong Kong is important for Beijing. So these challenges, I think, are more important, both for the Chinese central government and for Hong Kong SAR government. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. That's helpful perspective. The next question comes from one of our participants, and it merges with a question that I had. One of my graduate school professors was Graham Allison, who wrote a now highly regarded book on the US-China relationship called The Thucydides Trap, exploring the relationship between a rising power and an established power and what happens. One, would love to hear your perspective on that thesis. Two, question from the participant is related in many ways. This question is about the US's role in resolving or being involved in the territorial claims in the South China Sea, and what role should the US be playing? So Dr. Shaw, why don't you start this time, and then we'll give Susan the second.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think the rising power versus the established power, this kind of framework to think, we use this kind of framework to think about the relationship between China and the United States. To some extent, this kind of framework has simplified the very complicated challenges that that China and the United States are facing now. So I would say, if we talk about IR theory, academic books, it's okay. It's a good book. It's a good theory. It's an interesting framework to understand the relationship between a rising power and an established power. But in reality, if we want to deal with the relationship between China and the United States, we should not use only one dimension to look at this bilateral relationship. The real relationship is much more complicated. If we just focus on the so-called trap, and then I'm sure we will fall into this trap. It's really not helpful. And the second question is about South China Sea. I would say these days, I think the military-to-military dialogue between China and the United States is very, very important on South China Sea. And we don't want to have conflict between two major nuclear powers. It's not in our interests. And then I think that if China and the United States can participate in some multilateral exercises, which focusing on those non-traditional security challenges, that would be better. I think the two militaries should keep professional, and then the two governments should have dialogues on South China Sea. Yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you. Susan, your response and thoughts?
Yeah, I think Dr. Allison's book was titled Destined for War. And I agree with Dr. Shao that this is certainly not what we should be thinking about in terms of the US-China relationship. It's far too complicated in the modern day. I mean, all of the examples in Graham's book are go pretty far back in history, and it was long before we established the current international system with its institutions and its rules and its interconnectivity. So I think that we need to be thinking about this through a different lens. It does explain, though, a bit the dynamic, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, that we're currently facing, which is the U.S. worry about how China is going to wield its growing power in the international system. And I think China has some serious explaining to do on that front, and has not been very clear about its intentions, or has not in its behavior kind of been reassuring in that respect. So I think China has a lot of work to do on that. For the US side, I would say we should be less insecure and less frightened of China. I don't understand really why, we've all of a sudden, and really it is connected more to this, administration than previously, why we're so insecure about our own place in the international system and our own system. And I think we should be more confident, frankly. With respect to the South China Sea, there's really the two issues. There's the issue of the rules-based order and the claims, which China has not clarified, which is it is keeping purposely ambiguous, which it has been sort of over the years pushing out and expanding under cover of this ambiguous 9-dash line, which it's refused to clarify the meaning of. And then there's the issue of the sort of security competition in the South China Sea, and what China's presence in the South China Sea means for the US military's access to that part of the seas, et cetera. And I think, on both of these issues, China has things that it needs to answer for. What is it doing with its military buildup in the South China Sea? What is it doing with the 9-dash line? What does it mean for the neighbors? China says that it's negotiating a code of conduct, with the other claimants. But that is obviously not a very satisfactory process from the standpoint of the other claimants, partly because it involves all of ASEAN, most of which doesn't have claims, and partly because China doesn't seem to be pursuing it very seriously, or trying to make it actually work. So, I think the US being seen to be clearly pushing on the rules-based order, upholding the rules, the free access for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which is a real concern. China keeps saying we're not interfering with freedom of navigation. Well, yeah, that is the concern, and some of the behaviors do not reassure on that score. And I think, these are all issues that we need to discuss. I agree with Dr. Shao that we need more discussion, but we need to get beyond the talking points that we've been on for the last 5 years on this. So I hope we can do that.
Thank you. Dr. Shao, there were a number of questions in Susan's, rhetorical questions in Susan's remarks. Do you care to respond, or would you like me to go on to the next question?
I think we don't have time to elaborate on those very difficult questions.
Complicated.
Like, military buildup. What are you going to do? Yeah.
The next question is related, and we'll try to wrap it up here in the next 4 minutes. It is the question about U.S.-China strategic competition narrative and the impact it has on U.S. treaty alliances in the region. Susan, do you want to open that one, and then we'll let Dr. Shao close, please?
I'm not sure exactly what we're getting at here, but I imagine it is connected to the issue of how do other countries in the region see the importance of U.S.-China relations, and also the deterioration in U.S.-China relations for their own future security and other interests, probably, right? I mean, I would say, other countries in the Asia-Pacific region are all very, very interested in the U.S.-China relationship, and they want to see it be predictable. They want it to see it be constructive, or at least, have the predictability gets at that, right? If we're not constructive, then it's a little bit unpredictable for them. They all are a bit, walking a line between being heavily dependent on China for their economic futures and being heavily dependent on the US in many cases for having the wherewithal to defend their interests in the sense of security interests from China, and they want to have the US there to help them with that, to be a counterweight to China so that they feel they have some balance in the system. And I think, that makes it a very tricky formula for all of us to navigate. And, I think the US also has incredibly enormous interests with China. We want to have a constructive and predictable relationship with China. We certainly don't want to be in a conflict with China. And I personally think that the framing of this being a strategic competition is not the right framing for this relationship, because it's far more complicated than that. And I think US interests will be given short shrift if we continue with that kind of a framing. So I oppose the strategic competition framing, and I opposed it when I was in the Trump administration, and I oppose it now.
That's helpful. Thank you. Dr. Shao?
Yes, I agree with Susan's view that the kind of a strategic competition between China and the United States in the region is not helpful for the stability and peace for the future of this region. The regional countries, they don't want to see this kind of strategic competition between the two major countries. And also, I would like to challenge the view that, which Susan mentioned, which is very popular, that the regional countries, economically, they want to stand together with China, but security, on the security front, they want US to play a role to defend for their security. I don't think so. It's just too simplified, because on the security front, those regional countries also want to have a stable relationship with China. So China is not a kind of a country who want to dominate the region. It's not in China's interest, I would say. But we don't have the time to elaborate that topic. But in general, I don't think we focus on the so-called strategic competition is in our two countries' interest. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we've reached the appointed hour, and I think we've accomplished our goal. We had a very respectful, thoughtful conversation about the U.S.-China relationship. This is, I think, a terrific example of, the objectives that we have at the Institute of building bridges. And I thank both of our friends, Dr. Shao, dialing in from Shanghai late at night, and Susan here in the United States, who were wonderful and very insightful. We hope you have a great summer. I also want to thank our participants. We had a large number join from both Capitol Hill, across the Washington policy community, and a number of foreign embassies. So I very much appreciate your joining us today. With that, I'll turn it back to Zev.
Great. Thank you, Kent, for your remarks and for moderating a really great discussion today. It is not easy to do that, especially in this virtual format. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Susan and Dr. Shao for providing your excellent insight today. You're both very busy, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I know that it is late in China, so thank you for sitting up with us, Dr. Shao. Just a couple final notes before we adjourn the session. If you've not done so already, especially for those of you who called in over the phone, please email china101@usasiainstitute.org to confirm your attendance, especially for congressional staffers, if you'd like to receive credit towards your professional development certificate. Today's briefing was also recorded, so if you missed part of the presentation or have colleagues that were not able to attend, we'll send out a link to the recording tomorrow morning. The next China 101 session will be shifting back to our usual time at 1 p.m. Eastern on Monday, the 27th of July. This will be the 8th and final session to our summer series. This briefing will focus on the role of cultural diplomacy in the U.S.-China relationship and features a very unique panel Chris Fenton, who's an author, film producer, and CEO of Media Capital Technologies, will be joining us in addition to Zach Ditwald, founding CEO of the Young China Global Group. We're excited to have both of these passionate and energetic speakers with us next week. We hope to see all of you for our final session next Monday. To close, I'd like to once again thank our corporate stakeholders for their support, those being Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, and ConocoPhillips. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this morning. Have a great rest of your week. If you are in Washington, D.C., I hope you stay cool. And thank you very much again, Kent, Dr. Shao, and Susan. We really appreciate your time.